Have you ever felt the stinging humiliation of being underestimated? Imagine sitting across from the person you loved, watching them laugh as they throw you away like yesterday's trash. That was Catherine. Her husband Richard thought he had won. He thought he was discarding a penniless housewife to run off with his younger mistress. He handed her a pen and demanded she sign away her life. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just signed. But Richard didn't know that the moment the ink dried, he wasn't becoming a free man. He was becoming a target. Because Catherine wasn't who he thought she was. And the man walking through the door was about to drop a $1 trillion bombshell that would leave the entire room gasping for air. This is the story of the silent signature that destroyed an empire. The conference room on the 45th floor of the Brown and Compey building in Manhattan smelled of stale espresso and aggressive cologne. It was a cold, sterile aquarium of glass and steel overlooking a gray New York City skyline that seemed to mirror the mood inside. Catherine Hale sat on one side of the mahogany table, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She wore a beige cardigan that had seen better days and a pair of trousers that Richard had once called aggressively plain. She looked small in the oversized leather chair. Across from her sat Richard Brown, her husband of 10 years. The CEO of Brown Tech, a logistics software company, currently valued at $400 million. He was leaning back, checking his Rolex Submariner, radiating the bored impatience of a man who had somewhere better to be. Specifically, with someone better. Next to him sat Jessica, his 24-year-old PR director. She wasn't trying to hide. She was scrolling through Instagram, popping chewing gum, her hand resting possessively on Richard's forearm. "Come on, Kathy." Richard sighed, not even looking at her. "Let's wrap this up. I have a dinner reservation at Le Bernardin at 7. Simon." Where are we? Simon LaGrange. Richard's attorney, a man known in New York legal circles as the Viper, slid a thick document across the table. "It's standard, Mrs. Brown," LaGrange said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Richard is being incredibly generous. You get the condo in New Jersey, the 2018 Toyota, and alimony of $5,000 a month for 3 years. In exchange, you waive all rights to Brown Tech, his future earnings, and the penthouse." Catherine looked at the papers. "The condo in New Jersey is in my name, Simon. I bought it before the marriage." LaGrange smirked. "And Richard paid the renovations. If we go to court, we'll argue commingling of assets. You'll lose it all. Do you really have the funds to fight us, Catherine? I charge $1,200 an hour. I assume your allowance won't cover that." Jessica giggled, whispering loud enough for Catherine to hear. "She can always go back to waiting tables. That's where you found her, right, Rick?" Richard chuckled. "She was a librarian, Jess. But yeah, same difference. Look, Kathy, don't make this hard. You're boring. You've always been boring. I need someone who fits the brand. Someone who shines. You just exist." Catherine remained silent. Her face was a mask of calm, though inside a tempest was raging. For 10 years she had played the role. She had cooked his meals, ironed his shirts, comforted him when his first startup failed, and used her savings to bail him out 3 separate times. He never asked where the savings came from. He just took it, assuming it was some small inheritance from a dead grandmother. "I'll sign," Catherine said softly. Richard blinked, surprised by the lack of a fight. "Good. Smart girl. But Catherine added, raising her eyes. They were a piercing, icy blue, the only feature of hers that ever unsettled him. I want one clause added. You're in no position to make demands, Lagrange snapped. A non-disclosure agreement, Catherine said. Mutual, absolute silence about our marriage and our divorce. Once I sign this, Richard, you never speak my name again. You don't mention me in your memoirs, your interviews, or your earnings calls. I cease to exist for you. Richard laughed out loud. You think I want to talk about you, honey? You're the mistake I'm trying to erase. Simon, add the clause. Let her have her secrets. It's not like the tabloids care about a librarian from Ohio. Lagrange scribbled the clause into the margins, initialed it, and spun the document around. Sign here, here, and here. Catherine picked up the cheap plastic pen provided by the law firm. She didn't hesitate. She didn't look at Richard's smug face or Jessica's triumphant grin. She signed her name. Catherine A. Hale. The sound of the pen scratching against the paper was the only noise in the room. It sounded like a match being struck. Done, Catherine said, capping the pen. Richard stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. Finally. Good luck with the... whatever you do. Send the keys to the penthouse by courier. He turned to Jessica. Let's go, babe. Champagne's on ice. Wait, Catherine said. Her voice had changed. The softness was gone. It was replaced by a tone of command that froze Richard mid-step. Sit down, Richard. Excuse me, Richard scoffed. The meeting is over. The divorce is over, Catherine corrected. The meeting is just beginning. I don't have time for your drama. You have time, a deep accented voice boomed from the doorway. Everyone turned. The double doors to the conference room, which were locked, swung open. Standing there wasn't the receptionist. It was a wall of men, 4 of them dressed in black tactical suits, earpieces clearly visible. They stepped into the room, securing the perimeter with professional efficiency. Behind them walked a man who looked like he had stepped out of a history book. He was elderly, perhaps in his 70s, wearing a bespoke 3-piece charcoal suit that cost more than Richard's car. He leaned on a cane topped with a silver hawk. Simon Lagrange dropped his pen. His face went pale. That's not possible. Richard looked confused. Who is this old guy? Security, get him out? The old man ignored Richard entirely. He walked straight to Catherine, bowed deeply, a bow of servitude, not politeness, and kissed her hand. Madam, the man said, his voice trembling with reverence. The transfer is complete. The board of directors is assembling in Zurich, but they are patching in via video link now. We were waiting for your signal. Catherine nodded slowly. She stood up. She didn't look small anymore. She looked like a statue made of steel. Thank you, Sebastian, she said. She looked at Richard, who was gaping at the scene. Richard, Catherine said, a cold smile touching her lips. You always said I was boring because I never talked about my family. You never asked. Who are you? Richard whispered. My name isn't just Catherine Hale, she said, stepping toward him. My mother was a Hale, but my father was Alexander St. James. The room went deathly silent. Even Jessica stopped chewing her gum. St. James? Richard frowned, trying to place the name. But Simon Lagrange knew. He was shaking. The St. James Sovereign Fund, the shadow bank. The family that bailed out the European Union in 2011. That's a myth. They don't exist publicly. We prefer privacy, Catherine said. Which is why I asked for that NDA, Richard. I didn't want my family's reputation stained by being associated with a bankrupt fraud like you." "Bankrupt?" Richard laughed nervously. "I'm worth 400 million. Catherine turned to the old man. "Sebastian, pull up the ledger." Sebastian placed a heavy, leather-bound tablet on the table. With a tap, he cast the screen onto the massive wall monitor that Richard usually used to display his stock prices. The screen didn't show stock prices. It showed a complex web of shell companies, offshore holdings, and debt transfers. "What is this?" Richard demanded, though his voice lacked its usual bite. "This," Catherine said, walking to the screen, "is the anatomy of your success, Richard. You built Brown Tech 5 years ago. You needed capital. You went to venture capital firms in Silicon Valley. They turned you down. Then miraculously, an angel investor from the Cayman Islands called Blue Horizon Holdings gave you $50 million. "Yeah," Richard said. "Lucky break." "Blue Horizon is a subsidiary of the St. James Fund," Catherine said calmly. "My money." Richard's eyes widened. 2 years later," she continued, "you were about to go under because of that lawsuit regarding the stolen code. You settled out of court for $20 million. You thought the money came from a bank loan from the Bank of Luxembourg." She tapped the screen. The line connected the Bank of Luxembourg to a trust named CAH. "Catherine, Alexandra. Hail," she enunciated. "My money." "And finally," she said, turning to face him, "your lifestyle, the penthouse, the vacations, the yacht you rent in Monaco. It's all leveraged against your company stock. And who holds the debt on that stock?" Sebastian spoke up, his voice dry. "The St. James Sovereign Fund holds 92% of the debt obligations of Brown Tech, Mr. Brown. Technically, you don't own your company. You don't even own your shirt." Richard collapsed into his chair. This is a lie. You're a librarian. I was hiding," Catherine said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I wanted to see if someone could love me. For me, not for the $1 trillion empire I will inherit. I gave you 10 years, Richard. 10 years to show me decency, to show me loyalty. And instead you cheated on me with my PR director and tried to leave me with a used Toyota." She reached into her purse and pulled out the divorce papers they had just signed. "You signed the divorce," she said, "which means our assets are now legally separated. You have your company, and I have my debt." "Wait," Simon LaGrange interjected, sweating profusely. "If you call in the debt now, Brown Tech becomes insolvent immediately," Catherine finished. "The assets will be seized to pay the creditor. That's me." She looked at Jessica, who was looking at Richard with horror. "Jessica," Catherine said pleasantly, "I hope you love him, because as of this moment, Richard is unemployed, homeless, and carries a personal liability debt of approximately $15 million that isn't covered by corporate bankruptcy protections." "What?" Jessica shrieked, pulling her hand away from Richard. $15 million? Oh, didn't you know?" Catherine pointed to the screen. "Richard signed personal guarantees for the last round of funding. He put up his future earnings as collateral. Since I am the creditor, I own his future." Richard stood up, his face red with rage and panic. "You set me up. This is entrapment. You can't do this." "I just did," Catherine said. "And you helped me. You were so eager to get rid of me you signed the waiver. You waived all rights to investigate my assets. You waived spousal support. You waived everything." Sebastian stepped forward. "Madam, the helicopter is landing on the roof. The private jet to Zurich awaits. The Global Council is expecting you." Catherine turned her back on Richard. "Goodbye, Richard. Enjoy the Toyota. I hear it gets great gas mileage. She began to walk toward the door, the security team parting like the Red Sea. Kathy, baby, wait. Richard scrambled over the table, ignoring his lawyer. We can talk about this. I was stressed. Jessica means nothing to me. It was a midlife crisis. Please. He reached out to grab her arm. Before he could touch her, one of the security guards moved with a blur of motion. He intercepted Richard's hand, twisting it behind his back, and slamming him face first into the mahogany table. Crack! Richard howled in pain. Do not touch the chairwoman, Sebastian said coldly. Catherine stopped at the door. She didn't turn around. She simply spoke to the room. Burn it down, Sebastian. Liquidate the company by morning. Sell the parts to our competitors. I want nothing left of Brown Tech but the letterhead. As you wish, madame. Catherine walked out of the room, her heels clicking on the marble floor. As the elevator doors closed, cutting off Richard's screams and Jessica's sobbing, Catherine didn't smile. She took a deep breath. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a cheap silver locket Richard had given her on their first anniversary. She looked at it for a moment, then dropped it into the trash can inside the elevator. The quiet librarian was dead. The Queen had returned. 48 hours later, Richard Brown sat on the hood of his 2018 Toyota Camry, parked in the lot of a Motel 6 off the New Jersey Turnpike. It was raining. He stared at his phone, his thumb hovering over the call button for Jessica. She hadn't answered his last 40 calls. The last text she sent was brief. My lawyer says I can't associate with a debtor under federal investigation. Don't contact me. Federal investigation. That was the new development. When Catherine. No, Catherine. Street James had liquidated Brown Tech. She didn't just sell the assets. She had released the internal audit logs to the SEC. It turned out Richard had been cutting corners to fund his lifestyle, moving money from employee pension funds to cover his gambling debts in Macau. He wasn't just broke. He was facing 5 to 10 years in federal prison for embezzlement. He looked at the newspaper on the passenger seat. The headline of the Wall Street Journal screamed, "The Silent Liquidation." Who is the mystery hand behind the collapse of Brown Tech? The article speculated about hostile takeovers and corporate espionage. No one knew it was his wife. His boring, plain wife who used to clip coupons for laundry detergent. You stupid, stupid man, Richard muttered to himself, banging his head against the steering wheel. 4,000 miles away in a chateau overlooking Lake Zurich, Catherine was undergoing a different kind of transformation. She stood in front of a mirror that was older than the United States. A team of 3 stylists moved around her like silent ghosts. The beige cardigans were gone. In their place was a gown of midnight blue velvet, tailored to fit a frame that had been hidden for a decade. The board is waiting, madame, Sebastian said from the doorway. He held a velvet box. Catherine turned. Do I look like her? Sebastian paused. You look like your father, madame. But you have your mother's eyes. He opened the box. Inside lay the St. James star, a 50-carat sapphire necklace that hadn't been seen in public since 1954. It was rumored to be cursed. It was rumored to be worth more than the GDP of a small island nation. Catherine lifted the heavy gems and fastened them around her neck. The cold weight of it felt like armor. They think I'm weak, Sebastian, she said, adjusting the clasp. They think because I spent 10 years playing house with a mediocrity like Richard that I've gone soft, that I've forgotten the old ways. The board is cautious, Sebastian admitted. The St. James Fund controls $3 trillion in assets. It influences elections, markets, and wars. They fear you have been domesticated. Catherine turned back to the mirror. Her expression was hard, the blue eyes burning with a cold fire. Domesticated animals are the most dangerous, Sebastian, because once the cage opens, they remember they have teeth. Let's go. She walked out of the suite, down the grand staircase, and into the great hall. 12 men sat around a circular table carved from black obsidian. These were not CEOs or politicians. These were the men who owned the CEOs and politicians. They were the high table of the St. James estate. As Catherine entered the room, didn't explode with noise. It exploded with silence. A heavy, suffocating pressure. One of the men, a heavy-set figure named Lord Halloway, didn't stand up. He swirled his cognac and looked at her with amusement. "So," Halloway said, his voice echoing, "the runaway princess returns. How was the peasant life, Catherine? Did you enjoy scrubbing toilets?" A few of the other men chuckled. Catherine didn't stop walking until she reached the head of the table. She didn't sit. She stood over Halloway. "It was educational, Lord Halloway," she said smoothly. "I learned that even the smallest pests can ruin a house if you don't crush them early." "Is that so?" Halloway sneered. "And now you expect to lead us, you who let a low-level grifter humiliate you for a decade. We need a leader, Catherine, not a victim." "Richard didn't humiliate me," Catherine said, her voice dropping an octave. "He was a test subject. I wanted to see how easy it was to manipulate a man's ego. I built him up from nothing, and in 48 hours I turned him into dust. It was a controlled demolition." She leaned in close to Halloway. "And speaking of demolition, Sebastian, pull up Lord Halloway's portfolio." The screen behind her flickered to life. "You have been betting heavily against the yen Halloway," Catherine said, "using the fund's reserves without authorization." Halloway's face went pale. That's a hedging strategy." "It's theft," Catherine corrected. "And it exposes us. As of this morning, I have liquidated your positions. I also bought the controlling stake in your family's shipping company in Liverpool. You work for me now." Halloway stood up, knocking his chair over. "You can't do that. I am a senior partner." "You were a senior partner," Catherine said. "Now you are a liability. Sit down, or I will have Sebastian remove you. And he doesn't use doors." Halloway looked at Sebastian, who was cracking his knuckles by the entrance. The Lord slowly, shakily, sat back down. Catherine looked around the table. "Does anyone else doubt my resolve?" Silence. Absolute submission. "Good." Catherine sat down in the high-backed chair at the head of the table. "Now bring me the file on the Valenti family. It's time we expanded into Asia." 2 weeks had passed. The world of high finance was buzzing with rumors of the return of the Queen, though few knew her face. Tonight was the unveiling, the annual Sovereign Gala in Vienna. It was the most exclusive event on the planet, hosted at the Hofburg Palace. No press allowed, no cameras, just the ultra-elite. Richard Brown was there. He wasn't on the guest list, of course. He had sold his Rolex and his last few shares of crypto to bribe a catering manager. He was currently wearing a waiter's uniform, holding a tray of champagne glasses, scanning the crowd. He looked haggard. His eyes were bloodshot. He had a plan, a desperate, insane plan. He knew Catherine would be here. He had tracked the St. James jet. He was going to confront her. He was going to beg, and if begging didn't work, he was going to threaten to cause a scene. He thought she would pay him just to make him go away. He needed money for a lawyer. The doors to the grand ballroom opened. The music stopped. "Her Grace Catherine Street, James," the announcer boomed. Richard froze. He watched as the woman he had called boring for 10 years walked in. She was breathtaking. She wore a dress made of silver silk that looked like liquid mercury. The sapphire necklace blazed at her throat. She didn't walk. She glided. And on her arm wasn't an old man or a bodyguard. It was a man who looked like a god of war dressed in a tuxedo. He was tall with dark, swept-back hair and eyes the color of steel. He moved with the same predatory grace as Catherine. This was Dominic Valenti, the heir to the Valenti weapons empire, the only family that rivaled the St. James in wealth. Richard felt a stab of jealousy so sharp it nearly made him drop his tray. Who was this guy Catherine and Dominic walked through the crowd, the sea of billionaires parting for them? They stopped near the center of the room. "They are all staring at you," Dominic murmured, leaning close to Catherine's ear. "They smell blood." "Let them stare," Catherine replied, taking a glass of champagne from a passing tray, not realizing the waiter was her ex-husband. She didn't even look at his face. When they stare, they aren't watching their pockets. "You destroyed Brown," Dominic said, a smirk playing on his lips. "Brutal. I liked it. But you left loose ends." "Richard," Catherine scoffed. "He's a ghost. Ghosts haunt people." "Catherine," Dominic warned, "and sometimes they show up where they aren't invited." Dominic's eyes flicked to the waiter standing 3 feet away. Dominic had noticed the trembling hands, the sweat, the intensity of the stare. Richard couldn't take it anymore. The sight of this man whispering to his wife broke him. "Cathy!" Richard shouted, dropping the tray. The crash of shattering glass silenced the ballroom. Catherine froze. She slowly turned around. She looked at the mess on the floor, and then up at the man in the waiter's uniform. "Richard," she said. Her voice wasn't angry. It was bored. "You're spilling the champagne. That's vintage 1998. "Is this who you are now?" Richard screamed, stepping over the broken glass. "You ruin my life, and then you come here to parade around with him." He pointed a shaking finger at Dominic. Security started to move in, but Catherine held up a hand. "Let him speak." Richard chest heaved. "You owe me, Cathy. I made you, I gave you a home. I gave you a life. You can't just throw me away. I want half. I want half of the real money." The crowd murmured. It was embarrassing. It was pathetic. Dominic stepped forward, shielding Catherine. He looked at Richard with a mix of pity and disgust. "You must be the husband," Dominic said. "The man who threw away a diamond because he thought it was glass." "Shut up!" Richard lunged at Dominic. It was a mistake. Dominic didn't even take his hands out of his pockets. He simply sidestepped, and Richard, carried by his own momentum, tripped over his own feet and face-planted into the puddle of champagne and glass shards. Richard groaned, trying to push himself up. Catherine walked over to him. She crouched down, her silver dress pooling around her. She didn't help him up. "You want half, Richard?" she whispered loud enough for the room to hear. "Half of what? My debts, my enemies, my burdens." She stood up and addressed the room. "This man," she pointed at Richard, who was bleeding from a cut on his forehead, "is a lesson to all of you. He had everything. He had loyalty, he had love, and he traded it for a cheap thrill and a momentary ego boost. Now he is on his knees." She looked down at Richard. "There is no settlement, Richard. There is no payoff. You are not a victim of my wealth. You are a casualty of your own stupidity. Now get out before I have you arrested for trespassing." "You can't," Richard sobbed. "I have rights." "You signed them away," Catherine reminded him. Security grabbed Richard by the arms and dragged him backward. As he was hauled away, kicking and screaming, Catherine turned back to Dominic. "I apologize for the entertainment," she said. "It was low-brow." Dominic laughed, a low, dangerous sound. "On the contrary, it was quite theatrical. But Catherine—" His face turned serious. "You just humiliated a desperate man in front of the world's most powerful vultures. You didn't just break him. You made him a weapon." "What do you mean?" Catherine asked, narrowing her eyes. "A man with nothing to lose is the only thing dangerous to people like us," Dominic said. "And look over there." He nodded toward the balcony. Standing in the shadows, watching the scene with a dark intensity, was a man Catherine recognized. It was Viktor Krovac, a Russian oligarch who had been trying to destroy the St. James family for 20 years. Krovac wasn't looking at Catherine. He was watching Richard being dragged out, and he was smiling. "He's going to recruit him," Dominic said softly. "Richard knows your face. He knows your habits. He knows your weaknesses. Krovac will use him." Catherine felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. "Then we will have to crush Krovac, too," she said. Dominic held out his hand. "Is that a proposal, Mrs. Brown?" "It's St. James," she corrected, taking his hand. "And it's not a proposal, Dominic. It's a merger." As they began to dance, the music swelling around them, Catherine knew the game had just changed. She wasn't just fighting an ex-husband anymore. She was fighting a war. And the battlefield was the entire world. The Vienna night was cold, but the cell Richard Brown sat in was colder. He had been detained by private security, then tossed out the back exit of the palace like a bag of refuse. He sat on a curb in a dark alley, his tuxedo torn, his face bruised. He had nothing left. No wife, no company, no dignity. A black Maybach pulled up to the curb. The window rolled down with a silent hum. "Get in," a voice said. It was heavy, thick, with a Russian accent. Richard didn't move. "I don't have any money for a ride." "I do not want your money, Mr. Brown. I want your hate." Richard looked up. The back door swung open. Inside sat Viktor Krovac. The Russian oligarch was peeling an orange with a small, sharp knife. Richard hesitated, then climbed in. The interior smelled of leather and expensive tobacco. "You are angry," Krovac stated, handing Richard a slice of orange. "You feel stolen from." "She played me." Richard spat, the bitterness rising like bile. "She pretended to be nobody. She watched me struggle for 10 years while sitting on a pile of gold. Who does that? What kind of psychopath does that? A St. James?" Krovac answered. "They are not people, Richard. They are institutions. They crush everything in their path. I know. They destroyed my father's oil empire in the 90s. Krovac leaned forward. "But you have something I need. You were inside the walls for 10 years. You know her habits. You know her fears." "I don't know anything about her business," Richard muttered. "She kept me in the dark." "I don't care about the business. I have hackers for that," Krovac dismissed. "I need to know the woman. Where does she go when she cries? What is the one thing she values more than money? What is the password she uses for her personal diary? These are the keys to the kingdom. Richard." Richard thought for a moment. He remembered the quiet nights, the nightmares Catherine used to have, the way she would wake up screaming a name. "She has a weakness," Richard whispered. A cruel smile spread across his bloodied face. "Every year, October 14th, she disappears for exactly 4 hours. She never told me where she went. but I tracked her phone once, thinking she was cheating. And Krovak's eyes gleamed. She goes to an old abandoned orphanage in the Catskills, St. Jude's Home for the Unwanted. She sits in the chapel alone. October 14th. Krovak checked his watch. That is tomorrow. She'll be alone, Richard said. She never takes security there. She says it's sacred ground. She thinks she's safe there. Krovak laughed, a dry, rattling sound. No one is safe, Mr. Brown. Not anymore. Meanwhile, in a penthouse in Paris, Catherine was pacing. The merger with Dominic Valenti was proceeding, but she felt uneasy. Dominic sat on the sofa watching her. He had removed his tuxedo jacket and loosened his tie. You're tense, Cat. The gala was a success. The stock is up 4%. It's too quiet, Catherine said, looking out at the Eiffel Tower. Krovak was there. He saw Richard. He didn't make a move. Krovak is a sledgehammer, Dominic said. He's probably planning to bomb a server farm. No. Catherine shook her head. He's desperate. He's lost ground in the energy sector. He needs a kill shot, and he knows I'm the head of the snake. She glanced at the calendar on the wall. October 14th. Her face softened. The mask of the CEO slipped, revealing the grieving daughter. I have to go, she said. Dominic frowned. Go where? We have a strategy meeting with the Asian markets team in an hour. Cancel it, Catherine said. I have a prior engagement. Personal. Take the security detail. Dominic insisted, standing up. No, Catherine said firmly. I go alone. I always go alone. It's the one rule I never break, Dominic. Don't follow me. She grabbed her coat and walked out. Dominic watched her go, a frown deepening on his face. He pulled out his phone and dialed his head of security. Track her, Dominic ordered. I don't care what she said. Put a drone on her. If she stops, I want to know. The St. Jude's Home for the Unwanted was a rotting skeleton of a building nestled in the deep woods of upstate New York. It had been closed for 30 years. Vines strangled the brickwork. The windows were jagged teeth of broken glass. Catherine parked her rented sedan, a nondescript Ford, at the gate. She walked up the overgrown path, the dead leaves crunching under her boots. She entered the chapel. It was the only room that was still intact. Sunlight filtered through the dusty, stained glass, illuminating a single small wooden pew in the center. She sat down. She didn't pray. She just stared at the altar. This was where she had been found. Before she was a St. James, before the adoption, she had been an orphan here. This was the only place that felt real. The only place where she wasn't a trillionaire heiress, but just a lost girl named Birdie. Hello, Birdie. Catherine stiffened. She didn't turn around. She knew the voice. Richard. She stood up slowly. How did you find this place? Richard stepped out from the shadows of the confessional booth. He looked different. He was wearing a tactical vest. In his hand was a heavy pistol. You tracked me once, she realized. That time you accused me of seeing a yoga instructor. I knew you were lying, Richard said, his voice trembling with adrenaline. I just didn't know the lie was this big. Put the gun down, Richard, Catherine said calmly. You don't have it in you. You don't know what I have in me, Richard screamed. The gun waved erratically. You stripped me bare. Catherine, you took my life. Now I'm going to take yours. He's not going to kill you, Mrs. Brown, another voice echoed from the choir loft. That would be a waste. Victor Krovak stepped into view on the balcony, above, flanked by 3 men with assault rifles. Richard is here for the irony, Krovac smiled. The husband killing the wife. A domestic tragedy. The police will find your bodies here. Murder-suicide. Very sad. The markets will panic. St. James' stock will plummet, and I will buy it all for pennies. Catherine looked at Krovac, then back at Richard. You sold me out to him. For what money? For revenge, Richard said. But his hand was shaking violently. He looked at Krovac. You said we were just going to scare her. You said we would force her to sign the assets over. Plans change. Krovac shrugged. Kill her, Richard, or my men will kill you both. Richard stared at Catherine. The gun felt like lead in his hand. He looked at her blue eyes, the eyes he used to wake up to. Do it, Krovac barked. Richard choked. Crash! The stained glass window behind Krovac exploded inward. A figure rappelled through the shattered glass on a black line, swinging into the balcony like a wrecking ball. It was Dominic. He slammed into one of Krovac's guards, sending him over the railing. The guard hit the pews below with a sickening crunch. Ambush! Krovac screamed, ducking for cover. Gunfire erupted. The chapel filled with the deafening roar of automatic weapons. Catherine dove behind the marble altar as bullets chipped away the stone. Richard, get down, she yelled. Richard stood frozen in the middle of the aisle, paralyzed by fear. Drop the gun, you idiot! Dominic shouted from the balcony, trading fire with Krovac's remaining men. Richard dropped the gun. He scrambled toward Catherine, sliding behind the altar next to her. You brought him, Richard wheezed, terrified. He followed me, Catherine snapped, checking her phone. No signal. We're pinned down. Dominic was holding his own, but Krovac had heavy firepower. A grenade rolled off the balcony and landed near the altar. Move! Catherine shoved Richard. They scrambled away just as the grenade detonated, blasting the marble altar into dust. The shockwave threw them against the wall. Catherine's ears rang. She coughed, waving away the dust. She saw Dominic leap from the balcony, landing in the nave. He moved with lethal precision, taking out the second guard with 2 shots to the chest. Krovac, realizing he was losing, made a run for the back exit. He's getting away! Dominic yelled. Catherine grabbed Richard's discarded pistol from the floor. She stood up, her vision blurry, and aimed at the fleeing Russian. She fired. The bullet struck the door frame, inches from Krovac's head. He ducked and vanished into the woods. Silence fell over the chapel. The only sound was the settling dust and Richard's hyperventilating. Dominic walked over to Catherine. He was bleeding from a graze on his cheek. I told you to take security, he said, breathless. I had it handled. Catherine lied, leaning against a pew for support. Dominic looked at Richard, who was curled up in a ball, sobbing. What do we do with him? Dominic asked, raising his weapon. He led them here. He's a liability. Catherine looked at her ex-husband, a pathetic, broken man who had almost gotten her killed. No, Catherine said. She walked over to Richard. Get up, she commanded. Richard looked up, snot and tears running down his face. Are you going to kill me? If I wanted you dead, I would have let Dominic shoot you, she said. But you're not going to die today, Richard. Today you're going to work for me. Richard blinked. What? Krovac thinks you're his pawn, Catherine said, her mind racing, formulating a new plan. He thinks you hate me. We're going to let him keep thinking that. You're going to go back to him. You're going to tell him you escaped, and you're going to become my spy. I can't, Richard stammered. He'll kill me. I'll kill you if you don't, Dominic added helpfully, racking the slide of his gun. Catherine knelt down, grabbing Richard by the collar. "This is your redemption, Richard. You want to be important. You want to be part of the story. This is it. You are going to help me destroy Viktor Krovak from the inside. And if you betray me again—" She leaned close, her voice a whisper of ice. "There won't be a divorce paper to save you. There will just be a hole in the ground." She stood up. "Dominic, get the car. We have a war to win." As they walked out into the sunlight, leaving Richard shivering in the ruins of the chapel, Catherine touched the sapphire around her neck. The secret was safe, but the game had just become deadly. 3 months had passed since the incident in the chapel. Winter had gripped Moscow, turning the city into a sprawling landscape of grey concrete and white ice. In the heart of the financial district, the Krovak Industries headquarters loomed like a modern fortress. The 66th floor was a restricted zone, a sound-proofed nerve center known simply as the silo. Here the air smelled of ozone and stale coffee, recycled through industrial purifiers. Walls of monitors bathed the room in a cold blue light, reflecting off the pale, sweaty faces of 24 high-frequency traders and data analysts. Viktor Krovak stood at the head of the room, looking out the reinforced glass window at the snowstorm raging outside. He wore a suit that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. Yet he looked agitated, like a predator pacing a cage that had become too small. "Status," Krovak barked, not turning around. "We are linked to the global exchanges, sir." A lead analyst replied, his voice trembling slightly. "Tokyo, London, New York. All pipes are open. We have a direct line to the St. James liquidity pools. And the encryption keys—" Krovak turned his gaze to a solitary figure sitting at a terminal in the corner. Richard Brown sat hunched over the keyboard. He looked healthier than he had in the woods of New York. His physical wounds healed, but his eyes carried a hollow, haunted weight. He was dressed in a charcoal suit, provided by Krovak, a uniform of servitude. "I'm inputting the final sequence now," Richard said, his voice barely a whisper. His fingers hovered over the keys. Krovak walked over his heavy footsteps, echoing on the metal floor. He placed a hand on Richard's shoulder. It wasn't a gesture of comfort. It was a claim of ownership. "You are shaking, Richard," Krovak noted with a cruel smile. "Are you having second thoughts? Remember what she did to you. Remember the humiliation in Vienna. She treated you like a pet. Today, you become the master." Richard stared at the blinking cursor on the screen. The code string was long and complex, a digital dagger Catherine had allegedly kept on a private server. Krovak believed these codes would allow him to dump $3 trillion of St. James debt onto the public market instantly. It would be a financial nuclear bomb. The St. James Sovereign Fund would be insolvent within minutes, triggering a panic that would wipe out Catherine's legacy forever. "I'm not shaking because I'm scared, Victor," Richard lied, forcing his hands to still. "I'm shaking because I've waited a long time for this." "Good lad." Krovak leaned in his breath, smelling of expensive cigars. $50 million waits for you in the Caymans. A new face, a new name, a life of leisure. Just press the button." Richard took a deep breath. He thought of Catherine. Not the terrifying CEO, but the woman he had married. The woman who had given him a second chance in a ruined chapel. He typed the final command, EXECUTOCOL_ICARUS. "It's done," Richard said. He hit enter. The room erupted. "Orders are executing," the lead analyst shouted. Massive sell-off initiating. We are dumping the debt. 1 billion, 10 billion, 100 billion. On the massive central screen, the graph representing the saint. James Fund's value began to nosedive. It was a jagged red line plunging towards zero. "Look at it!" Krovac roared, throwing his arms wide. "Burn, burn it all down. I want her to watch her empire turn to ash." The room filled with the frantic clicking of keyboards and the cheers of Krovac's sycophants. They were witnessing the greatest financial assassination in history. Krovac poured himself a glass of vodka, his eyes glued to the screen, watching the percentage drop. -40%, -60%, -80%. "Sir." The analyst's voice cut through the celebration. It was sharp, confused. "What?" Krovac snapped glass halfway to his lips. "The volume, it's not clearing. The sell orders are being absorbed. Absorbed by who? Who has the capital to absorb a $1 trillion crash?" "Everyone," the analyst stammered, typing furiously. "The liquidity, it's reversing. Sir, look at the ticker." Krovac spun around. The giant screen flickered. The jagged red line stopped its descent. It hovered for a split second, pulsating. Then it turned a vibrant electric green. The line shot upward vertically. It wasn't just recovering. It was skyrocketing. "What did you do?" Krovac screamed, smashing his glass against the wall. Shards of crystal rained down on the carpet. "Why is the stock going up? We're losing our positions," another trader yelled, standing up in panic. "The algorithm. It's not selling their debt. It's leveraging our assets to buy it. Turn it off. Pull the plug." Krovac lunged for the server rack. "We can't. It's locked out. It's a hard-coded execution." Suddenly, the lights in the war room died. The hum of the computers vanished, replaced by an eerie silence. The only light came from the massive central screen, which turned pitch black. Then a video feed flickered to life. The image was crystal clear. It was a serene, sunlit office in Zurich, starkly contrasting the dark, panic-filled room in Moscow. Catherine Street. James sat behind her desk. She was wearing a white blazer, looking immaculate, calm, and terrifyingly composed. Behind her stood Dominic Valenti, leaning against a bookshelf, idly flipping a silver coin over his knuckles. "Good afternoon, Victor," Catherine said. Her voice was amplified through the war room's speakers, rich and smooth. "You look flushed. Is the heating too high in Moscow?" "You," Krovac pointed a trembling finger at the screen. "You did this. I have your codes. Richard stole them." "Richard didn't steal anything," Catherine corrected him, taking a sip of tea. "He delivered exactly what I asked him to deliver." Krovac slowly turned his head toward Richard. Richard had pushed his chair back from the terminal. He stood up. He didn't look like a victim anymore. He looked like a man who had walked through fire and come out the other side. "It's called the Icarus Protocol," Richard said, his voice steady in the silent room. "You wanted to fly Victor. You wanted to soar above everyone else. Catherine knew your ego was your biggest weakness. The code I entered, didn't authorize a sale. It authorized a swap." "A swap?" Krovac whispered. Dominic stepped forward on the screen, his smile wolfish. "You see, Victor, the algorithm you just ran identified Krovac Industries as the primary counterparty. Every time you tried to sell a toxic asset, the protocol automatically used your company's cash reserves to buy it at a premium. You just spent your entire fortune bailing out the St. James Fund. That's impossible, Krovac gasped. That's illegal. It's hostile corporate acquisition, Catherine said coldly. And since you used my encryption keys to do it, you legally authorized the transaction yourself. As of 30 seconds ago, Krovac Industries is a wholly owned subsidiary of my family trust. I own your buildings. I own your oil fields. I own the chair you are standing next to. I will kill you, Krovac screamed, foaming at the mouth. He ripped a pistol from his shoulder holster and aimed it at Richard. You traitorous rat, I will end you. Richard didn't flinch. He didn't cower. He just looked at the gun, then back at Krovac's eyes. I'm not a rat, Richard said softly. I'm the husband. Boom! The steel blast doors of the war room didn't just open, they disintegrated. A controlled charge blew the hinges inward, filling the room with thick grey smoke and the blinding flash of stun grenades. Drop the weapon! A dozen heavily armed Interpol agents clad in tactical gear swarmed the room. Laser sights danced through the smoke painting Krovac's chest with red dots. Krovac froze. Sebastian strode through the smoke using his cane to wave away the fumes. He looked impeccable as always. He stopped in front of Krovac, who was still holding the gun. Mr. Krovac, Sebastian said, his voice dripping with disdain. Please give me a reason. I have a plane to catch, and the paperwork would be tedious. Krovac looked at the agents. He looked at the screen where Catherine watched, without an ounce of pity. With a guttural scream of frustration, he threw the gun to the floor. Agents tackled him instantly, forcing his face into the carpet. As they dragged him away, shouting about lawyers and diplomatic immunity, Richard stood alone in the center of the chaos. He looked up at the screen. Are you okay? Catherine asked. The mask of the CEO slipped for just a second, revealing genuine concern. I'm alive, Richard said. He adjusted his tie, his hands finally steady. Did it work? Perfectly, Catherine said. The markets are stabilizing. You saved the legacy, Richard. Richard managed a weak smile. I guess I finally fit the brand. Catherine's expression softened. Sebastian has the package. The house in Montana, the new identity. The teaching job. It's a quiet town. No shareholders. No galas. Just history books and mountains. It sounds perfect, Richard choked out. He felt a lump in his throat. Kathy, don't. She stopped him gently. We aren't those people anymore, Richard. You found your courage. I found my kingdom. Let's leave it at that. Goodbye, Catherine, he whispered. Goodbye, Richard. The screen went black. 2 weeks later, the air was warm and smelled of jasmine on the private terrace of the Villa d'Este on Lake Como. The sun was setting, painting the water in hues of purple and gold. Catherine stood by the stone railing watching a small boat cut across the lake. She wore a simple white dress, her hair loose in the breeze. The weight of the last few months seemed to have lifted, leaving her lighter yet sharper. The St. James Star sapphire was gone, returned to the vault. She didn't need to wear it to prove who she was anymore. She heard footsteps behind her, heavy, confident, rhythmic. You're thinking about him, Dominic said. He didn't ask. He stated it. He walked up beside her, placing 2 glasses of vintage Barolo on the stone ledge. I'm thinking about the cost, Catherine admitted, picking up a glass. Richard wasn't a bad man, Dominic. He was just small. He wanted a small life, and I dragged him into a war of giants. I destroyed who he was, to save myself. He destroyed himself when he underestimated you, Dominic countered, leaning his back against the railing to face her. "You gave him redemption, a teaching job in Montana. That's more mercy than he deserved after selling you out." "Perhaps," Catherine swirled the wine. "Mercy is a luxury of the powerful. And now, we are very powerful." Dominic arched an eyebrow, a playful smirk dancing on his lips. "I thought the merger was purely business. Asset consolidation, market dominance." Catherine turned to face him. She looked at the man who had rappelled through a stained glass window for her, the man who had cleaned his fingernails with a knife while she dismantled a Russian oligarch. He was dangerous, unpredictable, and the only person on earth who didn't want her money because he had enough of his own. "The business merger is complete," Catherine said, stepping closer to him. The space between them crackled with electricity. "But there are other types of alliances." She reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a small, heavy object wrapped in velvet. She held it out to him. Dominic unwrapped it. It was an ancient iron key rusted with age, but polished smooth by centuries of handling. "The key to the Geneva vault?" Dominic asked, his voice losing its playful edge. "Catherine, this grants access to the root files of the St. James Foundation. The blackmail, the dirty money, the skeletons. If I have this, I could destroy you in an afternoon." "I know," Catherine said, holding his gaze. Her blue eyes were fierce, unyielding. "I've spent my whole life hiding, Dominic. Hiding from Richard. Hiding from the board. Hiding from the world. I'm tired of silence. I want someone who knows where the bodies are buried and chooses to stand beside me anyway." She placed her hand over his, closing his fingers around the key. "This is the ultimate trust," she whispered. "Don't make me regret it." Dominic looked at the key, then at her. He didn't put it in his pocket. He brought her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles with a reverence that made her breath hitch. "I don't want to destroy the Queen," Dominic murmured, pulling her close. "I want to help her burn the rest of the world down." "Then let's get started," Catherine said. She leaned up, and he met her halfway. The kiss was searing, a promise of chaos and glory. It wasn't the tentative, safe love she had known with Richard. It was fire. It was a storm. As the sun dipped below the Alps, plunging the lake into twilight Catherine Street, James smiled against his lips. The quiet librarian was a distant memory. The era of the silent signature was over. The reign of the lioness had begun. And that is the incredible saga of Catherine St. James. She showed the world that silence isn't weakness, it's preparation. Richard thought he could discard her like an object, but he learned the hard way that when you break a diamond, you don't destroy it. You just create sharper edges. From a silent signature in a lawyer's office to the toppling of a global tyrant, Catherine proved that the most dangerous person in the room is often the one listening. What would you do if you found out your partner was hiding $1 trillion secret? Would you react like Richard, or would you try to earn their trust? And do you think Richard deserved his happy ending in Montana, or should he have gone to prison? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of revenge, betrayal, and ultimate justice, please smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story. We release new dramas every week. Thanks for watching, and remember, never judge a book by its cover, especially if that book owns the bank.